In 2012, someone went on Reddit and asked people to share their personal glitch in the Matrix stories. A glitch in the Matrix story is any story where something totally unusual happens that doesn't have a logical explanation. So these are true stories, or at least purported to be true. They're first-hand accounts, and they're very popular on Reddit. And so this particular query on Reddit got very popular. It went totally viral. And so there were thousands and thousands of stories commented down below. So lots of people gave their glitch in the Matrix story. Now, the top comments, so the top stories that were given, were really, really interesting. But by far, the best response, the best glitch in the Matrix story, got no attention at all. It was buried at the bottom of 14,000 plus comments. This story, which was written by a person who just went by Sarah X11, should have gone completely viral. It should have been the top comment by far. But for whatever reason, it wasn't. And so now, 10 years later, no one really knows about it. While we don't know for sure if Sarah X11's story is true, as it is just an unverified first-hand account, what we do know is that this was the first story that Sarah X11 had ever posted to Reddit about glitches in the Matrix. The majority of her Reddit activity consisted of liking cute pictures of cats and dogs. So this person, this user, was not on Reddit for clout. Also, when Sarah X11 posted her story in this Reddit thread, there were already thousands and thousands of comments posted. So if they were trying to get recognized through this story, they chose the worst post to do it on. If you want to get recognized in a comment section and be a top comment, typically you have to be one of the very first comments after this thing gets posted. And so she's posting after thousands and thousands of people have done this. So in my mind, it seems like this post by Sarah X11, this story, has got to be true. And even if it isn't true, it's one of the coolest stories I've come across on the internet that is guaranteed to give you goosebumps. Okay, here we go. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds, so it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the two cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you." And then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours. And then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name because Aurora had given her her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life. In 1889, when Karl Tanzler was just 12 years old and living with his family in Dresden, Germany, he had a very strange dream. In this dream, he found himself in this black void where everywhere he looked, it was just nothingness. And then behind him, he heard footsteps. And so he whips himself around and he looks, and there's this woman dressed in this big, puffy, elegant white dress walking towards him out of the darkness. And when she walks right up in front of him, she comes to a stop and she introduces herself as Anna Constantia von Brockdorf, who was a real person in the early 1700s. She was a noblewoman in Germany, and she would tell Karl that she is actually a distant relative of his and that she was here to pass on a very important message. Karl was rooted to the spot. He didn't know if he should be afraid of what she was going to say or excited or nervous, but before he could decide, Anna had already turned and was pointing in the direction she had appeared out of. And so Karl turns and looks in the direction she was pointing, and out out of this blackness, out of this void, came this woman's face. It was a face detached from a body. It almost looked like a floating picture of a woman's face. And as this face floated closer and closer to them, Carl was immediately struck by just how beautiful this woman was. Her hair was jet black like a raven's feathers, and her skin was white like porcelain. But there was something off about this woman, this floating face. She looked sad and kind of frail. And so as Carl found himself staring at this face, which was now right next to them, Anna spoke to him again, and she would tell Carl that this woman, the floating face, she's going to appear in your life later on, and it is your mission given by God to save her. She's going to be very ill, very sick, and you need to find a way to keep her alive. Then Carl, in real life, woke up, and immediately he was struck by just how visceral that dream had been. It really felt like that had just happened to him, but after a few moments, it seemed like, okay, that was just a dream. But unlike other visceral dreams he had had in the past, this one did not gradually fade from his memory. Instead, over the course of that day, the memory specifically of the raven-haired woman's face really seemed to become more clear and more concrete in his mind, to the point where at the end of that day, he could easily remember exactly what she looked like. Over the following days and months and years, Carl periodically would have this same dream, this same vision of his distant relative Anna, who would come out of the void, and she would remind him to be on the lookout for this raven-haired woman when God sent her to him. But despite these constant reminders in his dreams, and Carl being ever vigilant to look for this raven-haired woman in real life, he never actually found her. He never met this woman he was supposed to save. Fast forward to 1926, Carl was 39 years old. By this point, he had gotten married, not to the raven-haired woman, but instead to a local woman in Dresden. And the pair had had 2 daughters together, and they lived a simple life. And, by and large, Carl seemed rather content and happy with his life. However, secretly, he was a little disappointed that these dreams, these visions that he was having of Anna and the raven-haired woman, that they had not come true, that it really had just been a dream. That year, due to an economic downturn in Germany, Carl and his family left Germany and emigrated to the United States, where they believed there would be better opportunities for them. And when they arrived in the United States, they settled in Central Florida. But within a year, Carl and his wife had a severe falling out, and they split up. And so Carl would leave the family home in Central Florida, and he would resettle several hundred miles south in Southern Florida in a town called Key West. And it would be in Key West that Carl would get a job as an X-ray technician at a local hospital, and it would also be in Key West that Carl's life would change forever. Less than a year after settling in Key West, Carl was at the hospital going about his day when an older woman walked into the office, and she said to Carl that she was there to get her daughter, her 21-year-old daughter, an X-ray of her chest, because her daughter apparently couldn't stop coughing and they were concerned about it. And so Carl began doing the paperwork with the mother when suddenly the daughter came into the office. And as soon as Carl saw her, he knew immediately that she was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. She walked in and she sat down in a chair, and Carl just stopped what he was doing and stared at the daughter. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned his attention back to the mother, and he said to her, "Ma'am, don't worry. I will do everything in my power to save your daughter's life." Now, the mother didn't know what was wrong with her daughter, and so this was both really helpful that this man she was talking to was so willing to help, and also kind of ominous that he was already insinuating that she could be dying. But either way, the mother said, "Thank you very much, we really appreciate that." And so Carl and the mother, they finished their paperwork, and then Carl quickly left from behind his desk and hustled over to the daughter, and he introduced himself, and he reiterated that she was in good hands. And the daughter was a little bit weirded out by this, but she was polite and said thank you, and she said her name was Elena. And so Carl would take Elena and bring her back and give her the X-ray, and unfortunately, he would discover through this X-ray that she had tuberculosis. Today, that disease is easily curable, but at the time, that was a death sentence. When Carl saw this, though, in a weird way, it almost made him happy, because this was another indication that, this really was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. Not only did she look the part, but she also had arrived in desperate need of help. And so now Carl needed to find a way to save her, even though he was just an X-ray technician. He was not a doctor, and so he had no clue how to begin to treat tuberculosis. But that didn't stop Carl. Over the next year, Carl Carl would be in touch with Elena and her family on a near daily basis, updating them on all of the new techniques to fight tuberculosis that he was doing all this research on, and he would tell them about experimental procedures and drugs they could try, even sometimes paying out of pocket for them to go try them. He would also bring Elena into the office as often as he possibly could to x-ray her again and again and again to see if perhaps she was making good progress. But unfortunately, over the course of that year where he was doing everything he could, it just didn't work. The disease ravaged Elena's body, and on October 31st, 1931, so roughly a year after Carl had first met Elena, Elena would unfortunately pass away. Elena's family was devastated by this, but their grief didn't even compare to Carl's grief. It was like Carl had lost his life too. He couldn't believe he had failed his mission and let the raven-haired woman die. When it came time to bury Elena, Carl said, "Let me pay for the most elaborate gravesite we can possibly make. Let me set up a mausoleum for her." A mausoleum is an external building that sits in a cemetery that effectively serves as a kind of shrine to the deceased. And so her family, they understood that Carl had become very, very close with Elena, although they didn't fully understand the relationship, but they did understand she meant a lot to him, and so they agreed to let him do this. After Elena was buried inside of this small temple that Carl had built for her, Carl began spending virtually all of his time kneeling inside of it, crying and begging for Elena's forgiveness. Elena's family was well aware that Carl was doing this, and at first they kind of just let it happen, but after several months, they began to tell Carl, you really need to let her go. You need to begin to move on. But Carl refused. In fact, over time, he only became more and more obsessed with Elena. Finally, after 7 years of Carl doing this, Elena's family decided, enough is enough. He really needs to stop making her loss all about him. It's not his loss, it's our loss. We're her family. And so the family decided the only way to kind of get Carl to stop doing what he was doing is to demand he give the key back that gave him access into the small area inside of the mausoleum. So one night, Elena's sister, whose name was Florinda, decided to go over to Carl's house unannounced and confront him and get the key back from him. And so she hopped in her car and she drove over to his property. His house was kind of set back off the road behind some trees, and so you had to drive down this kind of winding driveway to get to it. And so Florinda turned onto his driveway and she began driving, and when his house came into view, the first thing she noticed was a number of the windows on the first floor were all lit up. Clearly, Carl was home, and as she's driving towards the house, she's just looking in these windows, and for a second, she sees Carl, and he's very elegantly dressed in a suit or a tuxedo, and he's ballroom dancing with this woman who's also very elegantly dressed as well. And for a second, Florinda considered turning around and not disturbing him, but then she thought, you know what, this has been going on for so long, I just need to get this over with. And so she drove her car and stopped in front of Carl's house. She hopped out, she walked up onto his porch, and she knocked on his front door. Inside, she could hear music was clearly playing, but just a few seconds after she had knocked, the music was cut off, and then no one came to the door. And so Florinda knows there's people inside this house, and so she knocks again, but again, there's no movement in the house. It's just silent, as if the people inside are pretending not to be there. And so finally, frustrated, Florinda knocks on the door a third time and says, "Carl, I know you're in there. I have to talk to you about my sister. Please come out here." And so finally, she heard the shuffling of feet, and then she heard the sound of the door unlocking, and it opened up just a crack. And through this crack, Carl looked through, and he looked out at Florinda very suspiciously, and he said to her, "What do you want?" And Florinda would say, "Look, I'm here to talk to you about my sister. Can I please come inside for a second, or can you come out here and talk to me?" But Carl pretty much immediately said no, and then he shut the door. However, before he shut the door, Carl had very briefly stepped out of the way, allowing Florinda to see through that gap into the house. So before the door actually shut, she got to see who and what was inside that house. And what she saw was the woman Carl had been dancing with, and the woman was seated in a chair maybe halfway through the house, and she was facing the door, and Florinda knew immediately it was her sister. And so she's standing on the porch having no idea what to make of what she's just discovered. And so feeling kind of overwhelmed, she just kind of staggered off the front porch, she turned around, she ran into her car, and she drove off to tell the police. When the police came back, they knocked on the front door, and they demanded that Carl let them see the woman he was there with. And so at this point, Carl knew the gig was up, and so he opened the door and he allowed them to come inside. And when the police went inside, they saw the woman he was with, and sure enough, it was Elena. However, However, Elena was deceased and had been for 7 years. After her death, Carl said he was able to talk to her inside of her mausoleum, and so that was why he was going back there every single night, because he and Elena were spending time together. And then at some point in 1933, so 2 years after Elena has been dead and buried, Carl would say she told him while he was visiting her mausoleum that she didn't like being in the mausoleum and that she wanted to come back with him and stay at his house. And so the following day, Carl had shown up with a child's wagon, and he pulled her out of her coffin, pulled her out of the mausoleum, put her corpse in this wagon, and wheeled her back to his house. He had continued to go to the mausoleum every night for the next 5 years just to keep up appearances, but Elena's body never went back inside of it. She would stay at his house, where he painstakingly attempted to restore Elena's very badly decomposed body to its original form. He strung piano wire through her entire body, connecting all of her bones together to keep her skeleton intact. He replaced her eyes with glass eyes, and he began rubbing the special wax all over her skin. He also stuffed her insides full of rags in order to give her a full, natural look, and he constantly sprayed her with perfume to reduce the smell. Once she was, in his eyes, back to normal, he began spending as much time with her as he possibly could. He would change her outfits constantly, he would put on makeup, and he would give her new jewelry, and he would talk to her about the ups and downs of life. He would laugh with her, he would cry with her, he would sleep with her. Carl would admit that ultimately his goal with keeping Elena in his home was to eventually still save her life. He believed if he could somehow get her body up into the stratosphere, that the radiation up there would bring her back to life. And if he could do that, he would be fulfilling his God-given mission to protect her. But Carl never got a chance to launch her into the stratosphere. Instead, he was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. However, these charges would be dropped and Carl would be set free. As for Elena, her body was returned to her family and they would bury her in Key West. Stick around for a wild photograph at the end. On April 28, 1988, a flight attendant named Clarabelle was standing in the first-class section of a plane that was flying from Hilo, Hawaii to Honolulu, Hawaii. Once the plane reached its cruising altitude, one of the passengers in first class, a woman sitting in row 5, she asked Clarabelle for a glass of wine. And so Clarabelle smiled, she got the wine, she poured it into a cup, and she handed it to this woman. And when the woman took the cup from Clarabelle, Clarabelle just suddenly vanished. And for a moment, the woman in row 5 looked around confused, but then she saw something and she began to scream. It would turn out there was a crack in the ceiling of Aloha Flight 243, and it caused the entire roof over the first class section to blow off mid-flight, and it sucked Clarabelle out because she was the only one who was not buckled in. Miraculously, nobody else got sucked out of the plane, and the pilot landed the plane safely. As for Clarabelle, her body has never been found.